stand up, stretch, because he told me these were going to be like 10, 15 minutes. He's lying. Everybody get a little stretch in. Yeah. Because it felt good to stand up just now. There you go. Let it out, Pablo. Let it out. What do you, your pen? Oh, your phone. Oh, yes. Okay. Settling down. Thank you. Wow. These kids don't mess around. Okay. It's 2:30 already. Give me a break. Okay, I'm just putting my clock up so I can see how long we are here. So my name is Unji Ju, and I'm a curator based in New York. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands and Tilting Axis for inviting me to be part of this conference. So though I'm supposed to be an international curator, my purview hasn't really included this so-called region to date. So it's especially fortunate for me to be here to learn from my colleagues, some of whom I know, but haven't been able to see their work in depth, so thank you very much for having me here. Tobias asked me to participate in this conference to share with you some ideas and issues surrounding the biennial as a site for curatorial practice. And I've had the fortune to attend many international biennials through my work, and also to participate in the capacity of curator, commissioner, or artistic director on a few projects that fall into this category. Today I'm going to focus on the Sharjah Biennial 12, The Past, the Present, the Possible, which took place, the exhibition took place in 2015, but the project actually took place between 2014 and 2015 in Sharjah, which is located in the United Arab Emirates. Oh, I forgot to show you where I'm going here. To address, so I'm going to focus on Sharjah Biennial 12 to address some of the possibilities I see in the biennial format, which is linked to my desire to support infrastructural development for contemporary art in places that haven't maybe grown these resources naturally. But I should also note that when I talk about contemporary art and contemporary practice, curatorial practice, I tend to have a kind of non-complicity with art history. And my main concern is really how contemporary practice operates. And so whereas I have a doctorate in ethnic studies and I studied a lot about many of the terms that have been discussed and will be discussed in the coming days, I tend to avoid certain terms because I think we're currently in a condition that we don't have enough perspective on to really define the boundaries of. I think we are in a new moment of the movement of global capital and its effect on us that we do not have enough perspective to understand. So I will kind of avoid certain kinds of theoretical constructs, let's say. I'm showing you right now some photographs of the process of developing the project in Sharjah because I think when people hear about the United Arab Emirates or the Gulf, maybe, I don't know if you're from the United States and you're like over the age of 40, you probably think of night vision shots of bombing because that's actually how we learned about the Gulf visually. But it's actually, this is the perfect photograph actually. This is somebody from the Directorate of Archaeology, Dr. Isa, who was showing us this petroglyph field. These are the petroglyphs you can see that are just there in the open air. And the obvious residue of the sea. That was once the floor of the sea. And you're in the middle now of the desert. So it's a changing landscape insofar as when we think about these places in geologic time, which is something that we also have to remember. We don't yet know the outcome of our impact, and there are many things that are going to be far beyond us. This day we took the artists. One of the first things that we did was bring artists on group site visits. This was because I thought part of the job of being able to go somewhere is to really tried to explore information, and shared knowledge between artists and practitioners. So this particular day, we had arranged to go see this site called The Cave in Leja. And by total accident, they were actually live on the dig. There's like 2 weeks out of the whole year that they're actually digging still this site, because this man with his arm up in the middle of the shot, in about 2004, he first found evidence of the presence of man in this area, not 85,000 years ago like they thought, but 125,000 years ago at this very site. And he told us about this, and I'll tell you more about why that's important in a bit. So I'll tell you a few factors for how we tried to think about why Sharjah could be an interesting place to do a biennial, why it was interesting for me to do a biennial in Sharjah, and how we tried to shape the project or structure the project so that it could have an impact that we thought would be lasting. And when I say we, I mean, I grab into this grouping, the foundation, the Sharjah Art Foundation, because they were at every point the complete facilitator of this project. Ryan Inoue, who was my right-hand man for many, many years, including for this project, and the entire kind of curatorial and production staff at Sharjah, who I took for a serious ride there. I mean, those poor men had to work like crazy. So Sharjah Biennial started in 1993, and it was something that was developed by the government. And the idea for the biennial was that it would support art of the so-called region. So it was international, but maybe not international and contemporary in the way that the Gwangju Biennial, which started the next year, was. A lot of the work was coming from the tradition of so-called Islamic art, for example. So many things based in Quranic arts and so forth, which is understandable. In 2002, Sheikh Ahur Al-Qasimi, who was then 22 years old, saw Okwe and Wazer's Documenta and went home and said, why can't we have an international biennial like this in Sharjah? So this is so amazing to me, because then, the daughter of the Sheikh, not like I want to be famous, I want to be rich, I want to collect all this stuff. No, she said, why can't Sharjah be another center of contemporary art internationally? That's so crazy. That's why we love her. So she, in 2002, enlisted her teacher from now I'm forgetting his name. She enlisted one of her professors. No. British art teacher. We'll dub this in. I'll move my mouth now, and you'll dub in his name later. No, but he worked with. They worked together to, bring a new, artists from all over the world to present what was then the site of the biennial, which was a conference center, like a convention center. And it was very successful. And over the next years, she started to, she and the government started to think about ways that they could, kind of continue this effort. And they started to enlist international curators from the so-called region. And, one of the first important people that they worked with, of course, was Jack Persekian, who would go on to help Sheikh Ahur found the Sharjah Biennial Foundation in 2009, I believe, which is a shift from, having a Ministry of Culture that produces a biennial to then producing a biennial foundation, which would become its own foundation eventually and develop its own spaces and start finally to develop year-round programming and, from public programming to exhibition programming, grants, production grants, awards, a very complex system for the region. I should note that one of the main reasons that I wanted and was enthusiastic to join this project, to curate the project, was that I had been watching them for a while, and and artists who I had been working with who maybe were living in Beirut or Cairo or, maybe Palestinians living in New York, they were all telling me that, since maybe 2008, Sharjah is where it's at, like I remember camp in Bombay, everybody was like, you got to go to Sharjah, there's something happening there that's really special. So I was lucky to get that tip from artists and then start to watch them. And what I realized about Sharjah was it met the conditions that as a curator I had been looking for. And those conditions are, one, that each project has to support the development and understanding of the artists' practices who are involved in the project. Two, that your work in these kinds of projects has to also advance the goals of the institution itself. Three, that we always have to make an attempt to reach as broad a public as we can. And four, that it should also help me as a curator to develop my own practice and my knowledge and skill set as a curator. And I think all of these things are really important so that we can take each other seriously, that we have this kind of relationship to our interdependency and our responsibility to each other. For a long time, artists or curators who were thinking about international practice, I would say since at least the 90s, like Franklin was saying this morning, we've spoken a lot amongst ourselves about what could the biennial structure do to develop contemporary art infrastructure where it didn't formerly exist. And you have the model of something like Gwangju, which was started in 1995, which is important historic site of political dissidents, but also kind of an area that for a long time was, if you ask people from the Jeolledo province, kind of ignored by the federal government in terms of cultural funding. And there was a moment where political representatives, presidents, were coming from that area and they started to put resources back into their area. So this is the condition that made it possible for the Gwangju Biennial to start, coupled with the advocacy of the artist Namjoon Paik. Paik Namjoon, or Namjoon Paik, as you might know him, was very much in his lifetime dedicated to supporting contemporary art in Korea and is responsible for the Korean Pavilion in the Venice Biennial by befriending the mayor of Venice and getting him to give Korea the very last spot on the Giardini, which was the toilets. And also in helping to convince politicians and cultural funders and cultural practitioners to support this effort in Gwangju. So we should always remember that artists are huge parts of these projects as well when our countries don't yet know possibilities. There's also the model, of course, of the Venice Biennial. And we were talking, some of us before, about what it meant, for the diaspora pavilion in Venice this year, or for these kind of successful national pavilions in this nation game, and and nations that are unrecognized, that have no state. What does it mean to go into those spaces? And I would just say that they're very important spaces, but we have to think at what cost. Literally, compared to our national spending on culture, right. At what cost do we present in Venice? Because that's no joke. And let me move forward. The model for Sharjah, as I was telling you before, was, to start with a biennial, develop it into something more international, more contemporary, and then into a foundation. And one of the key, contributions that Jacques Persekian and Sheikh Ahur have made to the so-called region of the Middle East is that they started something called the March Meeting, which was a kind of networking opportunity, not dissimilar to this, where people would come up, and actually some artists would tell me that they missed the old March Meeting, because the old March Meeting, if you were small space that had a project that didn't have funding, that's where you would shop it. You would try to get a museum or some other spaces to help you pay for the project and stuff like this. It had evolved and devolved in some ways. In some ways there were many more people involved, and international participants like me. Once we were included, we also diluted the project a little, I have to say. And And when they tried to do these March meetings with international participants who had no knowledge and sometimes no interest, really, in the area except for getting money, I think it's somehow hurt the discursive program, the possibility of that program. And so after attending and participating in several of them, I actually, for the structure of the Sharjah Biennial, I asked for it all. I wanted group site visits. Everybody has to come before they make a production. I wanted the March meeting in 2014, 1 year before the project was opening, so that we could actually use the platform to introduce the artists who would be commissioned. They would introduce their work to each other, to the public, and they would have to come to Sharjah and learn about Sharjah, and that their engagement would be for at least 1 year. And that also key players in the so-called region would hear from them. So key players like here, Christine Tome, who actually ended up becoming the curator of this year's Sharjah Biennial. We would also have enough money put in the budget for the artists to return for research. The development of a monthly arts talk series during the course of the development of the project, meaning the year prior and the 3 months of the exhibition, production money, commissioning money, installation money, fees for all artists, an exhibition, a film program that the foundation would participate in curating, because there are people on the staff who have way more knowledge than you do, and you always have to remember that. The following March meeting in 2015, and forcing them to move it to the end of the project, so that we wouldn't try to make the most important discursive event of the year in Sharjah during an opening, which I thought was always difficult. And finally, publication, which ended up to be this, fully bilingual Arabic and English publication, which is now part of this museum's collection. So you can look at it later. With contributions by the curatorial assistants, because that was another part of the impact is you got to make these kids write, and then you got to edit their writing, and then you got to show them what they did wrong. And it's a very long and painful process. So I mention these because I think when we start these kinds of projects, and if they're going to have a long-term impact, we actually have to be a little bit aware of the bigger picture and our goals. And so, part of this goal, as I said, was to train staff and the public about who don't have, the kind of so-called sophisticated training in art and art theory that we might in the Western and some of the Eastern world. But to train the staff and the public about contemporary art, and also to have them as, with the full buy-in as to how best to commission artists. So I think part of the training, I was talking to somebody the other day, yesterday, about how it's very difficult because we sometimes even have the funding to do a project, but we can't find the staff who have a passionate engagement with contemporary art because they've been trained to behave like secretaries or runners or librarians, and they don't know that, they need a super intimate, like you were saying, the super intimate relationship to the entire game, from talking through to, pounding some nails, cleaning up some sand, all of this, and that this could be all of our project together. So the idea to get the team involved intellectually, creatively, and practically from the very beginning was a really important, that's for you, Gabby, part. And so now I'm going to keep talking a little bit as I now show you some examples of the work, because whenever I couldn't travel, I always wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to see the works that were actually produced. But this first set of slides is work by Salwa Rawda Shoker, an artist that unfortunately just passed away last year from Lebanon. And some of you may have seen her work presented at the Tate. She was a very important woman who studied a lot about cosmology, science, architecture, and in her lifetime had almost no recognition, in her active lifetime had almost no recognition, and now today has been kind of reconsidered in terms of her contribution to, maybe a kind of Arab modernism. This is the work of Etel Adnan, another artist originally from Izmirna, but grew up mostly in Lebanon, and lived most of her life actually in Sausalito, California. These are tapestries on the wall and then very small acrylic paintings. This is a new tapestry that we commissioned by Etel. Etel turned 90 when we were installing the exhibition. This is the work of Rayan Tabet. It's hard to see, but that's an indication of a location, it says, I think, 0-something kilometers, and then a longitudinal and latitudinal position. And each of these rings represents a kilometer on the Trans-Arab Pipeline, which once ran from Saudi to the Golan Heights, the only object that traversed 5 countries in the so-called Middle East. And as my ode to the influence of Saudi, I blocked an entire wing of the museum with this work so that you could, you didn't need to see an image here. This is commissioned by Byron Kim. It's a night sky of Sharjah. And he came and he, made studies about the night sky and realized that because of the light conditions and pollution and electric light, of which there's kind of little compared to New York City, the color's almost identical to New York City. So in this series, Byron did this beautiful thing where he made 2 edges, and they represent the 2 minarets of the mosque, which is how you know that these are the Sharjah series. And he made 12 new paintings. This is the work of Mark Bradford, and there's a great story about Mark's piece, because this is, earlier you saw that there's a shipyard, very big port in Sharjah, and Mark thought these bumpers that kept the boats from hitting each other were very interesting. So he designed this entire series of works, Untitled Buoy, in which he built up in his, if you know Mark Bradford's work, a kind of his signature, let's say, collage method, which is to build up with paper and found paper and rope and twine and different kinds of materials, and then to sand things down to reveal the surfaces. So he made 15 of them. By the shippers went and picked it up on January 1st. Somebody had to come into the office, and then we had a shipping strike in the United States, and somebody diverted all of the works, which were also valued at, I don't know, $5 million, diverted the works to China. And we opened on March 5th, and I think they were going to arrive on April 14th. So I called Mark, and I said, I'm very ashamed. They screwed up. Your work is not going to be on the plane tomorrow. Don't come. I understand. I'm really sorry. Mark said, you know how busy I am. I love you, but I'm not coming. And I said, I know. It's fine. I'm really sorry. I'm really embarrassed. 30 minutes later, I get a text. It was 6:30 in the morning in Los Angeles, and the text said, we got this. And he called his entire studio in, and for the next 17 hours, they made these new works, and they sent them by FedEx. And he actually, of course, they made the base of them, and then they came and they had to rework them, so then for another week, he reworked them as he installed them on the street. And yeah, it's a beautiful work. As you cross the creek, there's a creek, a kind of semi-artificial creek which is almost like a free port. And so there are these dhows that actually travel mostly between Sharjah, Southeast Asia, these larger ships. They travel mostly between the Gulf, Southeast Asia, and Africa. It's super treacherous, size of a ship to make these kind of trips. The Arts Collective Camp has made a beautiful work about this several editions ago. But you also, the workers take from the mainland this small ferry across every day to go to work. And in one of the previous editions, the artist Shimabuku had found this boat and used it for his work. And so I used that as a cue to actually access warehouses on the other side. And to get onto this boat, it's a little wonky, and it costs about 25 cents. So you can imagine it's an interesting ride. But what's great, I thought I had the other slide, but what's great is that you actually come in contact with normal workers, and you see the way in which, they have to cross, and it's not free. It's something that they have to pay for just to cross to get access to cheaper goods or, to food away from the port. In the port area, there were some warehouses that were slated for demolition, and so we were given access to these warehouses. And Asuncion Molinos Gordo had done a work in Cairo commissioned by Townhouse Gallery called the World Museum of Agriculture, which is kind of like multiple narratives about the development of agriculture around the world. And she built this kind of false museum on the site that has, the first world narrative of the progress of, like hybridized seeds and whatnot, and then below the rate of suicide of South Asian farmers who can no longer produce rice, the indigenous rice of the region. Look at that cash. And then, also plays off of the hybridization, a sculpture. Asuncion Molinos Gordo. And this is actually a work from 2014, and it did win even though it was a reproduced work from an earlier time, it did win the award, the top award, I think, that year. This is a work by Michael Jew, who, in full disclosure, is also my brother. It's the first time we worked together, but the first artist I worked with as free family labor since the 80s. As any good immigrant family knows, that's how we get anywhere. Michael had done a lot of trips with Dr. Isa into the desert and learned about the historic irrigation systems, and was really interested in this point where nature meets mankind, and how man has intervened and changed, altered the entire geography. And here, what he did is he cleaned out a warehouse, and they worked to build these ravines in the cement. And then in the back, that's not silver paint, but actually a chemical reaction of silver nitrate, which is, was used in daguerreotype photography. And that reflective surface to Michael was about, as you walk forward towards the future, the reflection is the past behind you. And so the past and the future come together in your own reflection. And this is a way of thinking about our experience of, the immensity of this land. And all the dirt and whatnot that was displaced, he shoved in the back room. So it wasn't part of the official piece, but if you wanted to explore this really crazy building, you would suddenly find, mountains of debris. These are the spaces that Sharjah Art Foundation built, completed in 2013. So in the 11-year period from, becoming a contemporary art biennial to the period where they made this full dedication to become a year-round foundation. And mimicking, as you can see maybe, the architecture, the scale of the architecture that had been there traditionally. They made these incredible new spaces. This is an abandoned old courtyard, so these are the courtyards that existed prior, and this is work by Hegyu Young called Opaque Wind. And these are all kinetic insofar as the air will move these turbines, which is all, like most of this is leftover material, these are air conditioners and whatnot. And this was her idea, inspired by the many Korean migrant laborers who actually worked to build the oil infrastructure, which people don't really know about, but this is part of how Korea developed industrially, was to risk a lot of young men to work in the development of the oil infrastructure in Saudi and Kuwait and Iran, including her father. And this is a room that she made for them. This is the father's room. And it has, newspapers in Tagalog and Urdu and Hindi and Malayalam and many of the languages that are spoken in this area. And it's a place where you can sit in the cool shade and read your local newspaper and get out of everybody's sight. These are works by Lynette Yedon-Boache. She actually made 2 installations, one of women and one of men. I focus here only on the women. Yeah, this is it. And this is a work by Gary Simmons called What Do They Know of Cricket? Who Only Cricket Know? Which is the name of the book by C.L.R. James about, the colonies and the sport of cricket, which I think some of you are aware of. And Gary is named after a cricket player, and his father did play in the 1950s for the team of the West Indies. And one of the most beautiful things is Gary and I had tried to make a basketball court in St. Paul in 1997. There was like a public art. When we realized how complicated public art was, we both were like, no way. But in Sharjah it was possible, and we changed it to cricket because there are all these children who play cricket. There's a lot of kids from, you can see mostly South Asian children. And he wrote on the ground in Malayalam, Arabic, and English this phrase from C.L.R. James. And this is really early on. You can see the trees are still young. But today this site still exists. And there was no grass here, of course. There's no place in the that we know of in the whole United Arab Emirates, but certainly in Sharjah, there's no place where children can actually use a packed cricket mound, a cricket pitch. So we built a child-sized cricket pitch for them. And when Gary went to pick up the equipment, this was the best. The man in the cricket store asked him, "Why are you buying cricket equipment? You're obviously American, And he told him the story of how his father had been a player, and then he asked him his father's name, and this guy was the same age as his father, and he said, "I totally remember your father." And so, it was like this kind of moment that, like this guy who's super into sports has to go all the way at age almost 50, maybe, to the United Arab Emirates for someone to really recognize his father's contribution to the sport. It's kind of beautiful. This is work by Iman Issa, who Tobias also worked with at the Perez Museum. And this is work by Fahunisa Zaid, who's an important Turkish artist. And, she did these resins that haven't been on view since 1968 that her family showed me in their living room that we were able to put on view. Julie Meritu made 5 new paintings, and basically we had a little Julie Meritu museum. Jan Vo brought us the armpit of the Statue of Liberty from his piece, We the People. Papi Ebotani led some sapurs, a comedian, and himself a dancer through the streets of Sharjah with a piece called Fanfare Funérailles, which made me cry and made Hassan Khan also cry, many others. Abraham Cruz Villegas intervened in the bird and animal market. He found this market, he thought it was completely scary, but he decided to make the birds, the falcons, because falconry is very important there, sculptures on which to be displayed, since they already stand on these mounds anyway. And finally, Adrian Vishar Rojas intervened in what was a former ice factory, about an hour and a half away. So Sharjah is the only emirate that actually crosses from the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, to the Indian Ocean. And Kaaba is on the Indian Ocean side. And there, in front of this former ice factory, he had seen in Sharjah city evidence of composting that was being conducted by the government, and he asked the government about this composting, and the authorities lent him this compost, brought it 2 hours away, and donated it to this part of the country, which is great. But he wanted to meet this point where life and death converge, where where the land is not really made to sustain us, and yet we can make it sustainable for us we can make kind of a possibility for this space, which is a perfect, indication of the maybe overall sentiment of the project, which was about, what should new cities or what should new areas offer us? What should we expect of the so-called new? And part of what we need to expect is more than just going to work and going to sleep. There has to be more than this to life. And this is the title, The Past, the Present, the Possible, comes from the line, the past, the present, the possible can never be separated, from Henri Lefebvre, The Right to the City. And this is the last piece. He intervened by making these kind of sedimentary works, which are it's almost like a painting exhibition. Each of these layers of sediment encompasses organic materials of different sorts, from minerals to watermelons to fish to birds, skulls, fossils, seeds which grew. Adrian Villar Rojas. It's spelled Villar. He's from Argentina, so it's Villar Rojas. And he actually has a show, looks very good on Instagram currently, that just opened at the Kunstsala Bregenz. And some work on the roof of the Met right now. I just wanted to say that for me, when we think about how we share our access and our professional experience to grow organizations who need professional and institutional knowledge, the goal is to ultimately to actually try to contribute to the self-reliance of those organizations. So we're trying to offer tools, which then can be developed internally and locally. And so for me, the biggest success of this whole project was that I was looking on the internet for this edition of the biennial, and I saw that they're bringing groups of like 30 people out to that archaeological site. And that archaeological site was never available to the public. And Leonor Antunes did a beautiful work where she learned how to do the traditional palm weaving and rope twisting. And they're doing workshops on this for the public. Now like 30, 40 people, 6 times they did it or something. These kinds of, and when I spoke back to the deputy director, Im Shadid, she told me this is the kind of thing that was set in motion by giving people more responsibility, expecting, the engagement to be more serious and for a longer term. And so that thing that I think looks really transformative to the foundation would be like, the one thing I hope that the tools we gave them have allowed. Thank you very much.